The Apache had sat dead in Hangar 3 for 3 hours when Captain Eric Mallory climbed down from the cockpit for the fourth time that afternoon, shaking his head at the laptop screen displaying another fault code. Specialist James Lopez crouched beside the diagnostic cart, scrolling through error logs that made no sense. Fuel pressure normal, electrical systems green, but the startup sequence kept aborting at the same point. Frank Keene stood 20 feet away, pushing a wide dust mop across the concrete floor, keeping his path while clear of the maintenance area, but close enough to hear the frustration building in Mallory's voice. When the captain turned, half in jest and half in exasperation, and said, "Keene, you want to go ahead and start it?" The words hung in the air like a challenge no one expected to be accepted. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we'd like to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below with your city or country. Frank paused mid-stroke, the mop handle angled against his hip, and looked at the Apache. The AH-64 sat with its nose pointed toward the open hangar doors, panels removed along both flanks where mechanics had spent the morning chasing the intermittent fault. A ground power unit cart sat connected but idle, yellow cables snaking across safety-tape zones on the floor. The concrete showed fresh sweep marks from Frank's earlier pass, interrupted by darker patches of hydraulic fluid and the smudged boot prints of a half-dozen mechanics who'd rotated through. Mallory stood with his flight suit sleeves pushed up, sweat darkening the fabric at his collar despite the industrial fans running overhead. Lopez glanced between the two men, his expression uncertain. The hangar smelled of aviation fuel, hot metal, and the faint chemical tang of cleaning solution Frank had used on the restrooms an hour before. Outside, the distant whump-whump of another helicopter lifting off filtered through, a sound that had been background noise to Frank for 3 years of pushing brooms and emptying trash bins along this flight line. "If you're serious, Captain," Frank said quietly, his voice rough and gravelly in a way that came from years of yelling over rotor noise, "I'll take a look." Mallory blinked, then glanced at Lopez, who shrugged. The captain's expression shifted from surprise to something like amusement mixed with curiosity. "Knock yourself out," he said, stepping aside. Frank set the mop against the wall and walked to the aircraft with a slight but permanent limp in his right leg, each step careful but straight-backed. He was about 5'10", wearing a faded contractor work shirt over a plain gray t-shirt, worn jeans, and steel-toe boots that had seen better days. His face was narrow and weathered, deep lines carved around light blue eyes that usually looked tired but sharpened now as he approached the cockpit. Short, thinning gray hair showed beneath the edge of a baseball cap he removed and tucked into his back pocket. On his left forearm, visible when he reached for the ladder rail, was an old tattoo, a stylized Apache helicopter outline, and the words "ACO 1 to 101 AVAN" in faded black ink. He climbed the rolling stairs slowly, favoring his right leg, and settled into the pilot's seat with the ease of someone who'd done it thousands of times. His large, scarred hands moved across the panels, fingers tracing switches and indicators without hesitation. "Lopez," he called down, his voice carrying a clear command tone despite the quiet delivery. "Check your laptop. Tell me what the fuel sequencer status shows right now." Lopez scrambled to the cart, tapped keys. It shows green, sir. Mr. Keene. Check the auxiliary pump prime status. Not the main pump. The auxiliary." Lopez scrolled, frowned. "Shows it's in standby mode." Frank nodded once, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. His hands moved methodically, flipping 2 switches in sequence, then waiting. He reached overhead, adjusting a circuit breaker position that looked identical to the ones around it. "Now check it," he said. It's active now," Lopez said, confused. "But we didn't change anything in the sequence." "The early block Apaches had a quirk," Frank said, his eyes scanning the instrument panel with the focus of someone reading a familiar language. "If the auxiliary fuel pump doesn't get primed in the exact right order relative to the main system, the computer thinks there's a fuel pressure problem and aborts. The newer software changed the sequence, but the hardware didn't get the memo on some of these birds. You have to manually override the standby and force the prime, then let the main sequence catch up." He glanced down at Mallory, who'd moved closer to the ladder. "You followed the checklist exactly right, Captain. The problem is the checklist assumes a newer configuration." Mallory's expression had shifted from amusement to focused attention. "How do you know that?" Frank didn't answer immediately. He completed the startup sequence, his movements smooth and practiced. The APU whined to life, a high-pitched turbine sound that built in intensity. Then the main engine began to spool, the deep, powerful rumble of an Apache coming online, filling the hangar. The rotor blades, which had sat motionless for 3 hours, began their slow rotation, picking up speed until they blurred into a steady disk above the aircraft. Every person in the hangar stopped what they were doing and turned to watch. When Frank shut it down after 30 seconds and climbed back down the ladder, Lieutenant Colonel David Rios had appeared in the hangar's side entrance, drawn by the sound of an Apache starting when he'd been told that particular bird was grounded. Rios was 47, about 6'1", with short dark hair, showing flecks of gray, brown eyes that tended to narrow when he concentrated, and the solid build of someone who still maintained fitness standards. He wore his OCP uniform with battalion patch and subdued rank, a black watch on his left wrist. He stopped just inside the hangar door, taking in the scene. The Apache now silent again, Mallory standing at the base of the ladder, Lopez staring at his laptop screen in confusion, and the older man in contractor clothes descending carefully. "What's going on here?" Rios asked, his voice carrying across the space without shouting. Mallory turned, came to a loose position of attention. "Sir, we've been troubleshooting 312 all afternoon. Wouldn't start. Mr. Keene here, he got it running on the first try." Rios looked at Frank more carefully, noting the military bearing despite the civilian clothes. The way he stood with weight shifted slightly off his right leg, but his shoulders square. Then his eyes caught the tattoo on Frank's forearm. "What's your background, Mr. Keene?" Rios asked, his tone professional but curious. Frank hesitated, the discomfort visible in the tightening of his jaw. "I used to fly," he said simply. "A long time ago." Francis Michael Keene hadn't always been the man pushing a broom across hangar floors. In 1987, at age 26, he'd been Chief Warrant Officer Francis Keene, United States Army, attached to Company A, 1st Battalion, 101st Aviation Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. His call sign had been Razor 21, earned during early training flights when an instructor noted that his attack runs were precise and clean, cutting through target areas like a razor with no wasted motion and tight timing. The name stuck, and when he joined the 101 Estes Attack Helicopter Company, it became official. He flew the AH-64 Apache, transitioning from earlier Cobra experience, and by the time Operation Desert Storm began in January 1991, he logged over 1,200 flight hours and earned a reputation as the pilot other crews wanted on the radio when situations went sideways. On January 17, 1991, the opening night of Desert Storm, Frank flew as part of a group of Apaches tasked with penetrating Iraqi airspace to destroy early warning radar sites and clear a corridor for the massive air campaign to follow. The mission launched from staging areas near the Saudi border, flying into western Iraq under marginal weather conditions with dust in the air and uneven winds that made night vision navigation a constant challenge. When one of the lead aircraft developed a systems issue mid-route, threatening to compromise the mission's carefully choreographed timing, Frank took over navigation duties for a portion of the formation. His calm voice over the radio, cross-checking terrain features against GPS waypoints, kept the group aligned and on schedule. The strike hit precisely on time, destroying the radar installation and multiple associated SAM launchers. 0 friendly casualties. Multiple senior pilots later credited Razor 21's steady hand with keeping the formation from fragmenting during those critical minutes. 6 weeks later, on February 23, 1991, a U.S. mechanized company advancing near the outskirts of Basra ran into fortified Iraqi positions heavier than intelligence had predicted. Artillery and armored vehicles pinned the American troops down, and deteriorating weather reduced visibility to the point where air support seemed impossible. Frank's flight of 2 Apaches was diverted from a different sector to provide close support and reconnaissance. Working with a forward observer on the ground, Frank made repeated low-level passes through dust and smoke, identifying targets and directing his wingman's fire onto a rocky armor that threatened to flank the U.S. position. When a Bradley fighting vehicle took a direct hit and became disabled, Frank used his knowledge of terrain and enemy fire patterns, gained from hours of studying maps and previous missions, to guide a recovery team to the survivors. The company commander later reported that without those two Apaches, casualties would have been catastrophic instead of manageable. At least 3 enemy armored vehicles confirmed destroyed, dozens of American soldiers able to withdraw with minimal additional losses. Frank's unit knew him as meticulous and disciplined. Maintenance crews respected him because he never cut corners on pre-flight checks or post-flight debriefs, and he had a saying he repeated to younger pilots: "Trust the checklist." The phrase came from flight school instructors and test pilot training, a reminder that procedures existed for reasons written in blood and experience. In combat, that discipline meant knowing every switch, every indicator, every backup system so thoroughly that split-second decisions became instinct-backed by method. Then came February 26, 1991, southwest of Basra, along a narrow irrigation canal lined with farm structures and dirt berms that Iraqi forces had converted into fighting positions. Frank's section, 2 Apaches, Razor 2-1 and Razor 2-2, had launched on what was supposed to be a routine night mission: interdict withdrawing Iraqi armor and provide overwatch for a U.S. battalion advancing along the canal line. Razor 2-2 was crewed by Chief Warrant Officer 2 Daniel James Harper, 29 years old, and First Lieutenant Mark Ellison, 25, and on his first combat deployment. Harper was Frank's closest friend in the unit, the man he'd gone through stateside training with and shared a living space with during deployment. Harper was married with a 3-year-old daughter back in Texas, known for a dry sense of humor and the same meticulous pre-flight habits Frank practiced. They were working a grid west of the canal when the forward observer reported possible armored movement near a small compound. Frank and Harper moved lower to visually confirm. Through the green glow of night vision displays, Frank saw vehicle outlines near low buildings and trees. He called out bearings and set up a firing run. As they closed, muzzle flashes erupted from the ground. Small arms at first, then the distinctive, harsher chatter of anti-aircraft guns. Tracers climbed into the sky, white streams cutting through darkness. Frank's threat warning system lit up, beeping insistently. He heard Harper's voice over the radio, calm but tense. 2-2, tally armor, left of the road, taking fire. Frank rolled into a shallower attack angle, trying to keep both the target and Harper's aircraft in sight. He called for Harper to brake right and climb. The cockpit filled with engine noise, rotor vibration through his seat, the intermittent beeping of warning tones. He smelled cordite and dust even inside his helmet. The sky flared orange from explosions on the ground, mixed with the steady white points of stars above. Then Harper's voice cut mid-sentence. 2-2, braking right. Frank saw it happen. A bright white streak of tracers intersected the dark outline of Razor 2-2. A sudden blossom of fire erupted from the aircraft's midsection. Something critical hit. The Apache rolled unnaturally, a wounded spin that no pilot input could correct. Frank heard a short, garbled transmission that might have been Harper trying to speak, then nothing but background radio static and the constant mechanical whine of his own rotors. He watched Harper's aircraft descend out of control and impact near the canal bank, the explosion bright even through night vision. Frank immediately climbed and circled, calling for signs of life, searching for the wreckage's exact location and relaying coordinates to ground units. He pushed his Apache lower than tactical doctrine advised, trying to visually confirm any movement, any beacon, any indication that Harper or Ellison had survived. Incoming fire forced him to break off repeatedly. Each time he circled back, the wreckage showed only as a single burning heat signature, stabilizing into something that meant no one was moving down there. No emergency beacon ever lit up. He knew they were gone. Minutes later, while still covering the area and trying to coordinate a recovery team, A near-miss anti-aircraft burst sent shrapnel through the underside of Frank's aircraft. One fragment punched through the floor and lodged in his right thigh. He felt a sharp impact, immediate heat spreading down his leg, then a spreading numbness. He kept flying, breathing through the pain in controlled measures, until he could safely break contact and return to base. He refused immediate medical evacuation, staying in the cockpit until maintenance took the aircraft, walking with a limp and blood soaking through his flight suit. He spent hours in the operations tent, providing every detail of the engagement, reconstructing radio calls and timing, hoping some error or misunderstanding meant Harper might have survived. A recovery team confirmed the next morning, no survivors. 2 Kia, Harper and Ellison. When Frank finally allowed himself to be treated, lying on a cot in a field aid station, listening to distant generators, he stared at the tent ceiling and replayed every radio transmission in his head. Within 48 hours, the shrapnel wound bandaged and his leg partially functional, he was back in the cockpit because the rotation needed every pilot. Drop a comment if you or someone you know has had to navigate the VA system or transition out of service. Your experiences matter. And now, back to the story. In the months after returning from deployment, Frank thought he was handling it. He attended debriefs, filled out forms, stood at memorials for Harper and Ellison where their names were added to a plywood board in a tent. But nights became the problem. He woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, after replaying the moment Harper's aircraft took fire in dreams that slowed down and added detail he hadn't consciously registered. Loud bangs triggered intrusive flashbacks, a truck backfiring, a door slamming, and he found himself gripping whatever was nearest, knuckles white, pulse racing. Helicopter rotor noise sometimes sent him back to that night, and he'd have to concentrate on his breathing to stay present. He started avoiding conversations about Desert Storm, giving short answers or changing subjects. When a younger pilot casually described a training mishap as no big deal, Frank punched a locker hard enough to bruise his hand. At home, his marriage to Emily began to fracture under the weight of his withdrawal. Their son Michael, then in his early teens, learned to stay quiet when his father came home in a bad mood. Frank refused to attend a 4th of July fireworks display, then snapped at Emily when she pressed him about it. A family vacation ended early when a low-flying helicopter near the highway sent Frank's pulse racing and left him agitated for the rest of the day. The household became tense and silent. Frank left active duty in 1996 after 17 years of service. The accumulated effects of the leg injury and were making the decision easier. He found work as an aircraft mechanic for a regional airline maintenance contractor, but his concentration sometimes faltered. He double-checked everything obsessively, slowing his work pace. When a supervisor pushed him to move faster, Frank reacted with visible irritation that he couldn't fully control. He missed a mandatory staff meeting during a particularly bad stretch of nights, then got into a loud argument over shift scheduling. After snapping at a younger mechanic and slamming down a tool hard enough to startle others, he received a written warning. The second incident led to termination in 2003. He attended VA appointments sporadically, sitting in waiting rooms for hours past his scheduled time, filling out the same intake questionnaires multiple times. A therapist who'd never deployed worked through standardized prompts, taking notes, but rarely engaging with his specific experiences. He tried Prozosine for nightmares. It reduced intensity, but didn't stop them. Sertraline made him feel emotionally flat and disconnected, so he stopped after several weeks. Some symptoms were documented. Others were dismissed as adjustment issues. The bureaucracy reinforced his belief that he should handle things himself. By November 2005, 14 years after that night near Basra, Frank had cycled through warehouse work, construction site labor, and odd repair jobs. Each ended similarly. His irritability, sleep issues, or difficulty with authority led to conflict. The decision point came when he woke one morning to find Emily had packed a bag and left a note saying she was staying with her sister and taking Michael. The note was clear but not cruel. She couldn't keep living in limbo, waiting for the man she'd married to reappear. Frank sat at the kitchen table for hours, the note in front of him, realizing he had no idea how to fix anything. He drove to the VA, sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes with his hands on the steering wheel, then drove away without going inside. He stopped trying to hold regular employment. When divorce proceedings began, he moved out of the shared home, taking only a backpack with a change of clothes, his worn field jacket, the brass compass that had belonged to Harper, and an old pair of flight gloves. He left behind furniture, photo albums, most of his uniforms and medals. He left Emily and Michael, then 19, without a proper goodbye because he believed they were better off without his volatility. Shame was the primary driver. For the next 8 to 10 years, Frank drifted. He stayed near mid-sized cities with military presences, often sleeping under overpasses near industrial parks. He picked up day labor through temp agencies, swept floors, loaded trucks. Churches and shelters provided meals. Sometimes he slept in shelters when he could handle crowded rooms. Other nights he preferred quieter spots behind warehouses. He kept Harper's brass compass in his front pocket, a solid brass piece about 2 inches in diameter with a scratched glass face and a faint dent on the outer ring from when Harper had dropped it on gravel during deployment. The back was engraved DJH 1989. Harper's wife had sent it to Frank after the war with a thank you note. He almost pawned it once, but walked away from the shop. Eventually, he gravitated back toward regions where he'd last worked in aviation, ending up near a combined civil-military airport. He walked the perimeter fences, watching helicopters lift off, because rotor noise still made a kind of sense when nothing else did. One day in 2019, while doing odd jobs for a retired mechanic named Joe who ran a small auto shop near the airport, Frank saw a bulletin board notice at a convenience store: contract facility support, cleaning and grounds, hiring immediately. The notice listed the Army Aviation Support Facility's address. He called from a payphone and got scheduled for an interview. The interview was basic. Could he lift 50 pounds? Any felony convictions? Could he pass a background check? He passed. He took the job because it paid slightly more than temp labor, but mostly because sweeping hangar floors while listening to turbine engine spool felt more familiar than pushing a broom anywhere else. He'd been working there for 3 years by the time Captain Mallory joked, "Go ahead, start it." After Frank's brief explanation about the fuel sequencer quirk, Lopez ran a second test at Mallory's request. Frank walked through the startup sequence verbally from the ground while Lopez sat in the pilot's seat and followed the instructions. The Apache started correctly again, removing any possibility of coincidence. Mallory climbed the ladder and looked at the cockpit layout, then back at Frank. "That's not something you learn from a manual," he said, his tone no longer joking. "It's something you learn from doing it a few hundred times," Frank replied quietly, already turning to retrieve his mop. But Rios hadn't moved from his position near the hangar entrance. He'd been watching Frank's posture, the way he moved around the aircraft with unconscious familiarity, and that tattoo on his forearm. The unit designation, 1 to 101 Avian 101st, combined with the Apache silhouette and the year 91 beneath it. Rios had studied Desert Storm aviation operations during his professional development, had read after-action reports, and watched training presentations about early Apache combat missions. Something about the name, Keene, combined with that unit was triggering a memory. "Mr. Keene," Rios said, stepping closer, "what exactly did you fly, and when?" Frank's shoulders tensed visibly. He set the mop against the wall again and turned to face the lieutenant colonel. AH-64, he said. Company A-1-101 SD, Desert Storm. The hangar had gone quieter. Several mechanics who'd been working on other projects had drifted closer, sensing something significant happening. Rios's eyes narrowed, his mind working through operational history he'd studied. "Call sign?" he asked. Frank hesitated, the discomfort clear in the way his jaw tightened and his hands flexed at his sides. But under Rios's direct gaze, he answered, "Razor 2-1. Rios went completely still. His face paled slightly, and he took an involuntary half-step backward. Lopez, standing near the laptop cart, glanced between them in confusion. Mallory, who'd climbed down from the ladder, froze with one hand still on the rail. The name Razor 2-1 spoken in that context, meant something to Rios that the others didn't understand yet. He'd read about a mission near Basra in February 1991, a night engagement where an Apache pilot had stayed on station after his wingman was shot down, circling under fire to coordinate recovery efforts and protect a ground unit. That mission was used as a case study in aviation leadership courses, an example of courage and tactical judgment under the worst possible circumstances. Chief Warrant Officer 3? Rios asked, his voice quieter now, more careful. The canal mission? Frank nodded once, a small movement. Yes, sir. Mallory's eyes widened. He straightened unconsciously, understanding beginning to dawn that the man he'd jokingly told to start it wasn't just some prior enlisted mechanic, but someone whose combat record belonged in aviation history texts. Rios excused himself and walked quickly to the facility's administrative office, where he asked the civilian personnel coordinator to pull the contractor file for Francis Keene. The file was thin, basic employment information, background check results, emergency contact information, but included Keene's full name and date of birth. Rios carried that information to a computer terminal with access to military records databases used for service verification. He input the name and DOB, then waited while the system searched. The result came back with a service record for Chief Warrant Officer 3 Francis Michael Keene, U.S. Army, Aviation Specialty, 17 years of service from 1979 to 1996. Unit history showed assignment to Company 1st Battalion, 101st Aviation Regiment during Operation Desert Storm. Awards listed included an Air Medal with V device, Army Commendation Medals, and a Purple Heart. A linked document referenced casualty reports from February 1991 listing CW2 Daniel J. Harper and 1 LT Mark Ellison, Kia, aircraft lost during combat operations near Basra. Mission summary notes mention CW3 Keene, Razor 2-1, maintained station under fire to coordinate recovery. Rios printed the summary and walked back toward Hangar 3 with the papers in hand, his mind processing the implications. The man who'd been sweeping their floors and emptying their trash for 3 years had once been the kind of pilot other aviators studied and aspired to emulate. Back in the hangar, word had begun to spread in the way it does in close military communities. Lopez had mentioned the call sign to another mechanic, who recognized it from an old training slide about Desert Storm Apache operations. Within an hour, several soldiers were searching online for information about Razor 2-1, finding references in historical accounts and after-action summaries. The name Keene, combined with the 101st and that call sign, appeared in multiple documents about the Basra engagements. In the facility's IT office, Sarah Harper Ellison was troubleshooting a network issue when she overheard 2 soldiers talking. One mentioned, apparently this janitor, Keene, was some Apache pilot in Desert Storm. Call sign Razor 2-1. The name hit Sarah like a physical impact. She was 38, worked as a civilian IT contractor, and had taken the job for steady income without initially realizing the facility's specific aviation history. Her uncle, Daniel Harper, and her father's close friend had died in Desert Storm when she was a child. She'd grown up hearing sparse mentions of the Apache pilot who stayed overhead that night, but she'd never connected it to anyone real. She went home that evening and pulled out a folder of her late father's military papers and letters. In one letter, written by a soldier from a unit that had been near the canal line, she found a paragraph that mentioned Razor 2-1 by name. We had an Apache pilot overhead that night. He stayed longer than he should have. Men like that made it possible for us to come home. What would you do in this situation? If you were the commander and discovered your janitor was a decorated Apache pilot from Desert Storm, would you keep it quiet or make it public? Comment below and let us know. Now back to the story. The next morning, Rios scheduled a brief formation in Hangar 3, same location where the Apache had started 2 days before. Soldiers, mechanics, and several civilian staff members gathered in front of a cleared area near the aircraft. Frank stood off to the side in his contractor's shirt, hands loosely at his sides, his expression guarded and uncomfortable. The fluorescent lights cast harsh illumination across the concrete floor, and outside the open hangar doors, another helicopter could be heard starting up on the flight line. Rios stood before the formation, holding a single sheet of paper, the printed service record summary. He didn't begin with dramatics or build-up. He spoke in his normal, clear command voice. Most of you know by now that there was an incident earlier this week involving aircraft 312 starting issue and a contractor employee who solved it. What you don't know is who that employee is. He turned slightly, gesturing toward Frank. This is Chief Warrant Officer 3, retired, Francis Michael Keene. During Operation Desert Storm, he served with Company A, 1st Battalion, 101st Aviation Regiment, flying the AH-64 Apache under the call sign Razor 21. The formation was completely silent. Rios continued, reading from the record. Chief Keene flew multiple combat missions during Desert Storm. On January 17, 1991, he participated in the opening night deep attack mission against Iraqi early warning radar sites, taking over navigation duties when another aircraft experienced systems issues and helping to ensure the strike hit on time with 0 friendly casualties. On February 23, 1991, near Basra, his section provided close air support to a mechanized company that was pinned down by Iraqi armor. His actions directly contributed to the destruction of at least 3 enemy armored vehicles and enabled the safe withdrawal of dozens of American soldiers. Rios paused, his eyes moving across the faces of the formation. Everyone was staring at Frank now, who stood motionless, his weathered face unreadable. On February 26, 1991, Rios continued, his voice lowering slightly. Chief Keene's section was conducting a night mission near a canal southwest of Basra. His wingman's aircraft, Razor 22, was shot down by anti-aircraft fire. 2 men were killed. Chief Warrant Officer 2 Daniel Harper and 1st Lieutenant Mark Ellison. Despite taking fire himself and sustaining a shrapnel wound to his leg, Chief Keene remained on station, circling the area to coordinate recovery efforts and protect the ground units in the area. His aircraft was damaged, but he stayed until he could confirm the loss and relay exact coordinates. The silence in the hangar was absolute. Outside, the distant helicopter's rotors could be heard building to full speed, but inside, no one moved. Rios looked directly at Frank. Chief Keene logged over 1,200 flight hours during his career, served 17 years, and later qualified as a maintenance test pilot. He earned an Air Medal with Valor Device, multiple Army Commendation Medals, and a Purple Heart. And earlier this week, when our aircraft wouldn't start after multiple attempts by our pilots and mechanics, he identified a procedural issue that none of us caught, because he knows these aircraft better than our manuals do. Rios folded the paper carefully. I'm telling you this not to embarrass Chief Keene, but because you need to understand who works alongside you. Experience doesn't disappear when someone changes uniforms. We're fortunate to have him here. As Rios finished, the formation remained silent for several long seconds. Then, movement at the back. Sarah Harper Ellison stepped forward from where she'd been standing near the hangar office door, a manila folder in her hands. She'd come specifically for this moment, having heard through the facility's communication channels that Rios was going to address the unit about Keene. She walked slowly through the formation until she stood a few feet from Frank. "Mr. Keene," she said, her voice steady but carrying emotion underneath. He turned to look at her, his expression uncertain. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Sarah Harper Ellison," she said. "My uncle was Daniel Harper. My father's best friend served in a unit near Basra in February 1991. She opened the folder and pulled out a photocopied letter, old enough that the paper had yellowed at the edges. "My father kept this letter from one of his buddies who was there." Her voice wavered slightly as she held it out. "It mentions you, by call sign." Frank took the letter carefully, his scarred hands unsteady. He read the paragraph she indicated, his light blue eyes moving across the faded typewritten text. The letter, dated March 1991, described the chaos of that night near the canal, the confusion when Harper's aircraft went down, and the steady voice over the radio. Razor 21, calling out positions and keeping everyone coordinated until recovery teams could reach the area. The writer credited that Apache pilot with saving lives that night by staying overhead when he should have pulled back. Sarah's voice broke slightly as she continued. My father lived until 2018. He married my mother in 1993. They had 3 children. I have 2 brothers. Dad worked at a manufacturing plant for 26 years. He coached youth soccer for 15 years, affected probably 300 kids' lives through that. He saw his grandchildren. He had 5 grandchildren before he died. She paused, tears visible now, but controlled. He lived 56 years after that night. And in this letter, he said that men like Razor 21 made it possible for him to come home. Frank's hands were shaking now, the letter trembling in his grip. He tried to speak but couldn't find words. The emotional weight of hearing that someone had lived, had built a full life, had touched hundreds of people, and that his actions that night had contributed to that possibility, was breaking through defenses he'd built over decades. Sarah reached into the folder again and pulled out an old challenge coin, military-style brass with a unit insignia on one side. On the reverse, someone had used a jeweler's tool to engrave words, to Razor 2-1. You gave him 56 more years. Thank you. Harper family. She held it out. My family wanted you to have this. We tried to find you years ago, but couldn't. Frank took the coin with shaking hands, staring at the engraved words. His jaw worked silently, and moisture gathered at the corners of his eyes. Around them, soldiers and civilians watched in complete silence. Lopez was crying openly. Mallory stood frozen, his earlier joke about go ahead and start it, hanging in his memory with new weight. Rios watched quietly from the side, his expression solemn. Finally, Frank managed to speak, his rough voice barely audible. I always thought about the ones we didn't bring back, he said. Harper, Ellison, I didn't think much about the ones who did. Sarah nodded, her own tears falling now. My uncle didn't come home, but because you were there, because you did what you did, others did. That matters to us. The formation remained absolutely silent. No one applauded, no one moved. The moment was too raw, too personal for performative gestures. But the weight of recognition, of being seen, of having 30 years of invisibility lifted, was visible in the way Frank's shoulders shook slightly, in the way he had to look down at the floor for several long seconds to compose himself. Rio stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. Chief, you've been working here as a contractor, but effective immediately. I want to bring you on as a consultant for our maintenance and flight operations. We'll arrange proper compensation through the Guards Advisory Program. You'll work with pilots and mechanics, share the kind of knowledge that prevented us from keeping that bird grounded for days. And we'll connect you with proper medical and benefit support. I'll personally ensure that happens. Frank looked up, his expression overwhelmed. Sir, I don't need. With respect, Chief, Rios interrupted gently. You've been sweeping our floors for 3 years. It's past time we recognized what you bring to this unit. You don't have to decide today, but the offer stands. Mallory stepped forward then, not with a dramatic gesture, but with a direct acknowledgement. He came to attention and said clearly, Sir, Chief Keen, what I said earlier this week, the joke about starting the bird, that was disrespectful. I didn't know who you were, but that's not an excuse. I'm sorry. Frank looked at the younger captain and gave a small, tired nod. You didn't know, he said simply. Now we do, Rios said, echoing Frank's earlier words back to him. Sarah stayed close as the formation gradually broke up, people moving slowly, processing what they'd heard. Several soldiers approached Frank quietly, offering handshakes or just standing nearby in silent respect. Lopez came over, his face still wet with tears, and said simply, Chief, if you ever need anything, tools, help, anything, just ask. That evening, Frank didn't go straight back to his small rented room in a weekly motel on the edge of town. He sat in the facility's parking lot with the engine off, watching helicopters return from training flights and shut down on the flight line. The sun was setting, casting orange light across the tarmac. In his pocket, he carried Sarah's challenge coin alongside Harper's brass compass. Rios had given him a business card for a specific VA contact and offered to write a supporting statement for Frank's case. Linda Hayes, his civilian supervisor, had informed him that his hourly rate would be adjusted and his job title officially changed to reflect his advisory role. He also had a phone number, Michael's number, which Rios had helped him track down through GAR personnel channels and a few carefully made calls. Frank sat in his car for nearly an hour before he dialed. When Michael answered, there was a long pause after Frank identified himself. "It's your dad," he'd said simply. The conversation that followed was awkward. Long pauses, short answers, the weight of 20 years creating gaps neither knew how to bridge immediately. But they talked for 15 minutes, and before hanging up, they agreed to talk again the following week. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was the beginning of one. 2 weeks later, Frank attended his first new VA appointment, this time accompanied by a base liaison that Rios had assigned to help navigate paperwork. The experience was still bureaucratic. Forms, waiting rooms, standardized questions, but the presence of current command support and documented statement from Rios and Sarah's family changed how Frank was treated. A caseworker reviewed his file, noted the gap in care, and started the process of getting him properly rated and scheduled for consistent therapy. He'd also led 2 informal sessions with younger pilots and mechanics at the facility, held in a conference room with a whiteboard where he diagrammed startup sequences and walked through troubleshooting procedures for older Apache variants. He emphasized trust the checklist repeatedly, not as a slogan, but as a practical rule. Write it down, he told them. Don't rely on memory, even if you think you've got it. Your brain lies to you under stress. The checklist doesn't. Physically, Frank looked slightly better rested. The lines around his eyes remained, and the limp in his right leg was permanent, but he carried himself with a bit more purpose. He'd moved from the weekly motel to a modest studio apartment closer to the facility, with actual furniture instead of just a bed and his backpack. Sleep was still inconsistent. Some nights were bad, with the old nightmares returning, but some nights were easier now, and that was progress he hadn't experienced in decades. He still kept Harper's brass compass in his pocket alongside the challenge coin, and his worn flight gloves stayed in his locker at the facility. When he passed them, he'd sometimes take them out and flex his hands inside the Nomex material, feeling the leather palms and remembering what it was like to have his hands on cyclic and collective. 6 months later, Frank's role had fully evolved. He was still officially a contractor, but a significant portion of his time was designated for mentorship and procedural review. He helped refine local standard operating procedures for maintenance, cross-checking older documentation against newer systems and identifying potential gaps. He no longer swept floors or emptied trash. The facility had hired another contractor for that work. Instead, Frank spent his days in hangars and classrooms, teaching. On a cool morning in late fall, he stood next to a training Apache on the flight line with Lopez and a new mechanic fresh out of technical school. The young mechanic, barely 22, was struggling to understand why a particular gauge was reading inconsistently. Frank walked him through the diagnostic process step by step, explaining how older sensors sometimes needed a specific warm-up sequence before they'd report accurately. The new manuals don't always tell you that, he said. But if you skip that step, you'll chase ghosts for hours. The new mechanic listened intently, taking notes. Lopez, now more experienced and confident, nodded along and added his own observations from recent work. Frank watched them both, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. The satisfaction of passing on knowledge that might keep someone alive, might prevent an aircraft loss, might save the kind of pain he'd carried for 30 years. Later that afternoon, Frank sat in a diner booth near the base with Michael. They'd been meeting regularly over the past 6 months, weekly at first, now every couple of weeks as Michael's work schedule allowed. Michael was 39 now, with his own career and life in another state, but he'd made the effort to drive down multiple times. The conversations had gradually moved from cautious and surface level to something more substantive. They talked about everyday things, Michael's job, Frank's teaching work, and slowly, carefully about the years lost. "So you're back around helicopters again," Michael said, stirring his coffee. "That helped." Frank thought for a moment, watching through the diner window as an Apache lifted off from the distant flight line, its distinctive profile silhouetted against the afternoon sky. "It helps to be useful," he said finally. "Helps to know that what I learned, what I went through, it doesn't have to be wasted." If I can keep one of those kids from making a mistake that grounds a bird when it's needed, or from missing something that could cause a crash, then maybe it means something. Michael nodded slowly. Dad, he said, the words still feeling slightly awkward after so many years. I'm glad you're there. Glad you're doing that. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the diner's ambient noise filling the space. Through the window, the Apache completed its climb and turned, heading out toward training areas. Frank watched it go, his light blue eyes tracking the aircraft automatically, old instincts never fully dormant. The rotor noise was faint through the glass, but present, a sound that had been part of his life for over 4 decades in one way or another. He wasn't healed completely. There were still nights when the dreams came, still moments when a sudden loud noise sent his pulse racing, still times when the weight of Harper's and Ellison's deaths felt crushing. He still saw the therapist every 2 weeks, still attended VA appointments, still took medication that helped but didn't cure. But he wasn't alone anymore. He had Michael back in his life, had a role that gave him purpose, had soldiers and civilians who called him Chief and meant it with respect. That evening, back at the facility for an evening maintenance check, Frank walked along the hangar edge where Hangar 3's doors stood open. Inside, Aircraft 312, the same Apache he'd started 6 months before, sat ready for the next day's training flights, its systems checked in green. Lopez was finishing paperwork at a nearby desk, and a couple of younger mechanics were securing panels on another bird. When Frank entered, Lopez looked up and nodded. Evening, Chief. Evening, Lopez, Frank replied, his rough voice carrying clearly across the hangar. Everything's set for tomorrow. Yes, sir. All systems green. Followed the checklist exactly. Frank allowed himself a small smile, rare but genuine. Good man. Trust the checklist. The phrase hung in the air for a moment, carrying weight from decades of use in cockpits and hangars, from nights over Iraqi deserts to this quiet evening in a National Guard facility. It had meant literal survival once. Then it had been a painful reminder of systems that worked when nothing else did. Now it was instruction, legacy, something he could pass on to the next generation. Frank stood there for a moment, breathing in the familiar smell of aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid, listening to the ventilation fans and the distant sound of another helicopter shutting down outside. He wasn't the man who'd swept these floors invisibly 3 years ago. He wasn't the pilot he'd been in 1991 either. He was somewhere in between, carrying the weight of both, but no longer crushed by it. The Apache's blades were still, waiting for morning. Frank turned toward the exit, his limp slight but permanent, his posture straight. Behind him, the hangar lights reflected off the polished metal and plexiglass of aircraft that would fly again tomorrow, maintained and ready because people trusted the checklists, trusted the procedures, trusted the knowledge passed down from those who'd learned the hard way. And sometimes recognition came not from ceremonies or medals, but from someone joking, "Go ahead, start it," and discovering that the quiet man with the mop knew exactly how. Francis Keene taught us that expertise doesn't vanish when someone changes uniforms, and that the most valuable lessons are often carried by those we least expect. If stories like this one resonate with you, true accounts that honor service without exaggeration, consider subscribing to our channel. We share these stories every week, remembering that behind every forgotten janitor or overlooked worker might be someone whose skills once changed everything. Another story about hidden heroes is on screen now. Click it, watch it, and remember, the person you pass in the hallway might once have been the person others called when it mattered most. Thank you for watching.